it's daunting when there's, let's say, a new technology. The first thing we try to do is we say how we say, press the button on the machine. And then later on, we'll explain why we press the button on the machine. So it's sort of like that. You have to have a blend of both of those styles to kind of introduce something, but also explain how and why it works.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this Vendor Spotlight, we speak with Sarah B Cruz, CSS nerd at Pre-Treat CSS, and Dave Jagrosse from David Jagrosse Consulting. And we're going to have a conversation that has spanned 10 years since Dave was actually a beta user of the One Tray. And so we're going to be getting these beta users' perspectives because Sarah actually worked in the department with Dave when he introduced the One Tray. And so obviously things have changed over the last 10 years. We're going to get their perspectives in this conversation today, and we're going to be sharing what may be some new information to many of you listeners as well. So stay with us. We're going to be right back after a short break with Sarah B Cruz and Dave Jagrosse.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Sarah B Cruz, CSS nerd at Pre-Treat CSS, and Dave Jagrosse from David Jagrosse Consulting. I'm really excited to have the two of you on the show today, and I can say that both of you have done a lot on Beyond Clean. Sarah, you've been participating in a number of our conferences and virtual webinars and conferences. And then, Dave, this isn't your first time on a podcast with us either. So really excited to have both of you. Sarah, just in case there's somebody out there that doesn't know you, can you start by just introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's Sarah B Cruz. Listen, I have a ton of letters after my name, but all they pretty much mean is that I'm a CSS nerd. I do sterile processing 365, 24/7. Well, not usually on Saturdays. I try to give myself a break then. But I am a CS Quality Education Development Program Coordinator. I also teach at my local community college, the sterile processing program. And I just love mentoring and making myself available to the up and coming industry professionals that will lead our industry into the next wave of expertise.
Excellent. And Dave, why don't you introduce yourself just in case there's somebody who hasn't heard you on the show before?
Sure, absolutely. Again, great to be here. I'm Dave Jagrosse. I've been in the business essentially all my life. I like to joke around that I process the instruments that I was born with. I've been in the CS world for probably about 33 years now. Everything from a technician to a supervisor to a manager, past president of HSPA, on the AMI boards. And again, just like Sarah mentioned, I'm here today independently as Dave Jagrosse Consulting. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. And the two of you are prominent figures at conferences and on the speaking circuit. So I do also just want to give you both a lot of credit for the amount of time that you put into educating the industry, which is obviously something we care a lot about here at Beyond Clean as well. But I know that takes you away from your homes and puts you on the road, and it does require, just a certain level of dedication to the industry. So I know today what we're going to be talking about is one tray, but from a very unique perspective because the both of you were beta users, and that started over 10 years ago. And so this is a decade-long discussion that we're going to have today. And I'm going to have you take us all the way back to the beginning here in a minute. But I just love the fact that I'm sure things have changed a little bit in the industry, but as much as things change, a lot stays the same too. And so we'll be getting into that as we talk today. Dave, let's start with you. You're both a longtime user of One Tray, but as we mentioned, you were a beta user. So when you initially saw this product, what were your thoughts? And were you easy to convince that this was something that would work for you in your facility?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I mean, it's funny. It's actually shocking and to realize that it was 10 years ago. Time goes by so fast. So yeah, when the One Tray showed up on the wooden buggy, the horse-drawn buggy, it was really, as it is today, it was a game changer because prior to this device showing up, wetness or any kind of moisture that was retained inside of an instrument set was a no-go. It was a stop the line and reject it. There might have been a couple of other devices on the market that were used in a true IUSS modality in the OR, but down in sterile processing, if anything came out with moisture on it, that item was rejected.
So how hard were you to convince that this was something that you could use? Did you put up a fight, or were you just like that challenging customer, or how did that go?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it first showed up, I had to have what I referred to as the aha moment. I was literally going to escort the rep out of the department and tell him never to come back because I just couldn't get a grasp around the technology. But as I read more and I read the data, and you always hear this statement that the facts matter. When I read the facts and I had that aha moment, I instantly became a believer in the product and instituted it in the department.
So how did you meet Sarah, and how did she get introduced to One Tray?
Sarah and I had the pleasure of working together.
Don't tell them everything, Dave.
Yeah, I got to say, Justin opened it up in the beginning, and it's really been a joy and a pleasure to watch Sarah grow. As myself, I was mentored by people above me. This is the way it works in our profession where, we mentor each other. But Sarah and I worked together, and, she had to put up with me introducing all this new technology in the department.
And to speak to that experience, the whole grabbing the rep and tossing him out of the department, let's recognize David Jagrosse for being stoic, because I didn't see any of that. The confidence that he relayed on the floor while introducing this new product, while we were ready to balk this idea that moisture wasn't going to be a concern in this type of innovative technology. So the confidence that he had in the product because of research and the way that he related to us was a phenomenal way to begin my relationship with something innovative and something challenging.
Yeah, Justin, as you might imagine, it's daunting when there's, let's say, a new technology. The first thing we try to do is we say, how we say, press the button on the machine. And then later on, we'll explain why we press the button on the machine. So it's sort of like that. You have to have a blend of both of those styles to kind of introduce something, but also explain how and why it works.
So Sarah, you talked about how Dave kind of led that process from a leadership perspective, but I really want you to dive a little bit deeper into what your experience was like as that was going on and as the One Tray was being introduced to you and just that whole onboarding and implementation of a new technology. What was that like?
So first of all, I can't believe it's been 10 years because I think that really put me in a wow, I've been doing something long enough to see a technology enter into the space. So that makes me feel a certain level of I've been in sterile processing. You know what I mean? So I think that's exciting. But the beginning of my onboarding experience was not necessarily tumultuous, but very questioning. I was uncertain, I was unsure, but I truly believe that underneath Dave's management, and because he did look into the facts and put his integrity behind the product, I felt confident as a technician moving with that progressive type of thinking. And frankly, it felt good to be a part of something that challenged the way we've always done things that could have a positive effect on patient safety. And seeing my relationship evolve with my professional development was also interesting, right, Dave? Because we parted ways at some point,
Absolutely.
but my relationship with OneTray continued.
Correct.
How much did policies come into effect, right? Because, I've gone into some departments and the policies are really a mess. There's a book and they're basically like falling out of this 3-ring binder, and you can tell they haven't been updated in a really, really, really long time. And I can imagine that this is, to some extent, you need to have some policies in place that sort of address new technology so that everybody knows, hey, this is how we do business. How much did policies come into play for the successful implementation?
Oh my gosh, significantly. Because I think OneTray often gets mixed up with the lack of policies. Because we don't have substantial policies and good standard works in place, there's so much left to the end user to determine for themselves and not have the type of backing that they need. So I know that during my initial experience and even into the use of OneTray until the FDA letter came out, I felt confident because my standard work was sound. I had the facts to back it up, and I had leadership that believed in it. And I worked in places that had policies to promote that type of use, because we all know what happens. Like, Dave, you sit on these committees, the shoulds and the coulds and the woulds, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you're left to the policies really standing into the space of interpreting industry standards and even regulations, building out these shoulds, coulds into this is what we are going to do because this is how we do things as a facility.
Sarah brings up a great angle or point here that I always say this when I go in and do audits into many hospitals that I go out and do audits with, that if you don't have robust policies or standard operating procedures, you're going to be subject to whatever accreditation body comes in, you're going to be subject to their interpretation of what a standard may be that's out there. Your policies and procedures are very powerful tools that if you develop them accordingly and follow them, because it's one thing to develop a policy and it's another to implement it and follow it, they're very powerful tools and can bring you a very long way towards your end goals.
And that's true because most people aren't feeling the impact of the FDA letter. They're feeling the ineffectiveness of their tracking systems, of their policies, of their SOPs, or even having upper level executives support them in the way that they need while they embrace innovation in the name of patient safety.
So, Sarah, you mentioned that you parted ways at some point from your mentor, and I'm assuming that was like your chance to grow and advance your career. So when you went to another facility, I think you also mentioned you were a user of OneTray at that new facility as well. Did you have the same strong policies and vendor tracking systems, et cetera, in place, or did you have to build infrastructure?
So I have fortunately held multiple positions since parting ways with Dave. Don't worry, Dave, I still miss you. I'm glad we get to hang out on Beyond Clean.
Correct. And Sarah, I think I might have left you actually, right? Because I kind of reached a point where I was ready to go full-time consulting. So it's kind of unique, like everything else we do, right, Sarah?
No hard feelings, right? Well, maybe a little bit. No, I digress. But, when I moved into some facilities, there were not policies. So I was bringing the energy and the fortitude and the baseline knowledge that I had because of my sound OneTray experience and, bringing in the energy of good policy from previous facilities. But I was working in a facility when the FDA letter came out, and I watched the hard stop utilization of OneTray, like literally spending the weekend popping trays open, just every beautiful one-way wicking filter just gone to waste, and all the sterility being broken just because of this warning letter. And frankly, it was devastating for me because, I had used the product so soundly and felt so sure that it really made me question my own professional integrity, like I was a bad technician, and it affected me.
I understand that they took the letter seriously, but it wasn't a recall. It's a warning letter. So, what do people need to understand about the difference there?
Well, and I think Dave can speak to this just because, Dave, you work in those spaces where language is very acute, right? You can't call a tomato a tomato. It's either a tomato or a tomato. Right?
Correct. And it's first of all, we have to understand that it wasn't a letter to customers. It was a letter from the FDA to the company. And the company has had resolution partially to that letter in that, a core part of that letter was a sort of an argument about shelf life or storage. And we're at a point now where if you've been on LinkedIn or you've seen some of the recent information coming out from the company, that the FDA has recognized that the device has 48 hours of storage. So it's sort of a shame that we're already in year 3 through a pandemic and through blue wrap shortages and all the other things we've been through with a device that clearly has been on the market for 10 plus years now that is definitely safe and effective. And trust me, I would not have used this device if it was otherwise. And nothing has changed in that 10-year space other than sort of this letter coming out. And then more recently, the FDA saying they do have 48-hour storage and that they are, in fact, compliant.
And then, Justin, you even said it, recall. The power of that term is so substantial, and to make that assumption or that determination based off not the accurate information or the information that's made available to us really sent ripples effects through sterile processing, not just the facility space that I was in, So, and then trying to teach individuals how to speak on a product because they're not speaking accurately about it. No, you can't just use the term recall. No, you can't just say terminal storage and immediate use. And no, it's not flash. Let's all get on the same page. And I know that Dave has felt this frustration when he was trying to explain it to me in onboarding, but it's so hard to describe innovative technology when there's language for it that doesn't exist yet because it's so revolutionary, right?
Yeah, Sarah, great point, because I wanted to make sure we sort of brought that up in that I think a core of the confusion, if you will, out there is not with the device, but with a process that you just mentioned, with immediate use sterilization. And, if we were to I mentioned LinkedIn, if we were go on LinkedIn and say, what is IUSS to you? I bet you we would get 100 different answers. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about how Flash evolved after the 2011 multi-society position paper, how it evolved into IUSS, and exactly what that process is. It's really hard to get into a conversation with someone that doesn't have those fundamentals, because it's sort of a flawed conversation if you don't have that strong background.
Okay. Sarah, I realize that the warning letter created some confusion throughout the industry. How did you approach that with your policies as a result?
Yeah, sure. And if anything, this warning letter demonstrated why policies have to have the space to be a living, breathing document, right? Very much leaning into the space to allow for the evolution of new information, new scientific data, because as we know in sterile processing, it's always evolving, right? So after the FDA warning letter, we had to make sure that when policies were being constructed, one, we clearly defined the terms being used in the policy. That's huge. You can't just assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, because frankly, I don't believe in the term common sense. Everything we know has to be taught, including the terminology we use in policies. And I actually picked that up from Dave. So thanks, Dave. Shout out to Dave.
Thank you. I also want to bring up another angle or element that certainly in Sarah's position, let's say, it becomes certainly a more challenging environment when all of these external departments we work with in the hospital suddenly take a gaze at our department. They don't know what we do. They don't know how we do it. But all of a sudden, there's this letter from the FDA. We have risk management involved. And now we're trying, as a manager, trying to explain how to navigate this. And again, not to speak on other managers, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, but if your strengths weren't, like I said, if you didn't have a fundamental understanding of the base of this discussion, it would be very hard to sell that to the rest of the hospital. So what I'm trying to summarize is that it almost essentially, we got bullied into almost changing our policies out of a risk, out of a non-existent risk that was perceived.
So, and it's that moment that Dave just articulated as why terminology needs to be sound and definitions need to be clear in policy writing. I think Dave is also alluding to this idea that the quality of our policies before they are needed must be sound, right? So when we move into this reaction state, it's because we need something to come out of the situation, usually quickly or as a result of something impending, right? So when we have a good construction of the body of our policies, it takes into fact future state concerns or issues that we might have. So we're not pushed into this reactive state of superseding existing policy because it didn't foresee or forecast any type of probable cause, right? So in that space, we wouldn't be pushed to supersede what we had already put in place because we were proactively thinking of problem-solving situations. The other part I'd actually like to jump to is the last part of policy writing is the, reassessment date. How often are you going to look at this policy? When you have policies in place around evolving information technology with all sterile processing is not just limited to one tray utilization, right? You can't just set these policies and ignore them for 5 years. You have to visit them frequently, and especially in touch and go items like this, every 6 months. Do you have to look at it every 8 months? So that's a key indicator there too in policy creation.
So once this warning letter closes, are you going to have to adapt that policy again? I know you're saying review it regularly, but would you have to adapt it again in response to that?
Sure, as you should with every type of policy. You should be looking into them more than yearly, I personally believe, in my own experience. I realize that when committees aren't well delegated in responsibilities, it could fall on the shoulder of one individual, and that's why it usually takes long. But yeah, definitely, especially on items like this, it will need to be revisited, as it should be, and dare I say, created in some spaces, right? Because even now, some facilities don't have policies around
a lot of things. Yes, I can say.
A lot of things. Consulting Dave says yes.
Yes. It's keeping me busy. Okay. One of the things when I fully ran my department that Sarah was part of, we did loaner trays. We moved forward, and it not only saving time, but in eliminating wet packs and eliminating holes in the wrappers. And all of a sudden they discover a hole in the wrapper in the middle of an ortho case, and everything needs to be reprocessed. We eliminated so many problems that it was really like going backwards once a decision is made that, hey, we're going to pull back on these devices. I feel like it set us back a far way. Forget about the whole IUSS. Is it IUSS? I think just to clarify things, IUSS, immediate use steam sterilization, is bound to immediacy. That's the key term. It has to be used immediately. If you look at the current AMI and AORN definitions, which are really based on the 2011 multi-society document, that is the key to immediate use, is that immediacy. And I'm going to give that as a little hint out there, because if people decide to go out there and write these policies, I want you to keep that in the forefront of your mind. But with the recent announcement and what I recently saw on LinkedIn, that the FDA recognized 48 hours of storage, you cannot have storage and call it immediate use. They don't coexist. So just for clarity, that might confuse some, but hopefully it clears it up for many.
Another opportunity we have here is making sure that we have standalone policies. When we start to mix multiple points into one overbroad, oversweeping policy, a lot of the little parts get missed, right? So we want to make sure that our policies are specific enough that they speak to a point, but not too broad as that they're all encompassing. So the power of a standalone policy regarding certain processes that feed into certain actions really can be profound in healthcare systems. For example, if you have an IUSS policy, the power of making specific action items or policies of the products used in an IUSS reprocessing really can allow us to update policies more accurately and really not change an entire process, but allow for technology and growth to happen that's inevitable in our field.
All right, so let's kind of take this to the final piece of the conversation, which is, if you were going to be onboarding one tray, now I'm sure it's a lot different than it was 10 years ago. So, before all of this, when you first got started, and either one of you can answer this or both of you, what was that process like of educating yourself? And then I'm going to do a part 2 after that, which is what your recommendations would be now. But we really are talking about how this has all changed over the last 10 years. Can you start with what you did to educate yourself 10 years ago? And then maybe you would add some best practices to that if somebody were to onboard with one tray today.
Justin, you said it though. What would you do to educate yourself? And a lot of it in the spaces that had no leadership policies, guidelines, things like that, was educating yourself, you determining what you thought was best practice, not moving in the department culture or making that space for learning. It was 100% independent study, so for the spaces that didn't have leadership that was well versed in it, which I recognize my privilege in that space, that my onboarding experience with one tray is not typical. A lot of it is self-discovery and figuring things out. So I would say that's the first thing to recognize is yourself, in all these spaces. They were just like, hey, good luck out there, go on, get them,
Yeah. And Sarah, there wasn't a lot of when I was introduced to the product, there wasn't a lot of users out there. We were the beta users. So there wasn't a lot of who can I call and who can I go to and who can I lean on? What do you think about it? So,
did you just look at the studies? In the data?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why, but wouldn't you just do the same thing today anyway? Wouldn't you still just look at the data and the science objectively like you would with any other technology? That wouldn't change.
No, it wouldn't. And I think there's actually more studies done because certainly from the company's perspective, they didn't have as many studies maybe the day that the device was introduced to where we are 10 years later.
And now we have the studies for application, though, because that's what's really evolved, right? So because of this reintroduction of the sterile processing educator and really delegating that responsibility solely off of managers to not just run the floor, but also professionally develop their team, you have this ability to create an onboarding process in general, so you have the educator who's reading the IFUs, researching studies, discussing with the manager their end goals, and then creating competencies, evaluations, assessments, and then even standard work videos, processes, hand over hand. So really incorporating those 4 audio, visual, kinesthetic, hands-on learning, writing aspects to create that robust why, not just pressing the button on the autoclave. Let me show you how. Let me teach you why. So I think that's been the evolution, especially with the introduction of more scientific studies and more proof of the integrity that is one tray. It makes it even easier to really make that program.
I think a manager today also has history on their sides. We've been talking the whole podcast about 10 years. If I would challenge everyone out there, if this product isn't safe, if it isn't effective, where is the studies or where is the evidence that shows it is not? Because, I see chats on LinkedIn and about moisture is going to destroy the instruments. It's going to damage this. It's going to damage that. Yet 10 years in, I don't see any studies showing an increase in repair budgets or failure of devices. The data just doesn't exist because the risk doesn't exist. I think there's a lot more opinion out there than what we like to say is like, let's stick to the facts,
Well, Dave and Sarah, you've done a phenomenal job with the interview, and you didn't just tell your story of being an end user and a beta user initially of the One Tray. You kind of gave us a little glimpse into your history together as kind of mentor and mentee. But Dave, I gotta tell you, I think Sarah just kind of like lapped you, and really killed this episode. So,
yep.
No, you
there
both
always
did a
comes
nice
that
job.
day.
Yeah, I just gotta tease
there
it.
comes that point in your life where you run faster than your father. So, here it is. She's able to run faster than me. But that.
Well, and let's pay kudos, Dave, because you always taught me that part of our jobs as professionals is to continue to advocate for innovation in our industry space. That's the only way sterile processing is going to grow. That's the only way it's going to feed our industry knowledge pipeline. So honestly, it comes from a foundation.
Absolutely.
So let's speak to that and make sure we're being true to our professional
And Sarah,
integrities.
and what do we say? What does the rising tide do?
Lifts all boats.
That's right. So that's how we do it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Dave. Great job as always.
Thank you.
And Sarah, really phenomenal. Enjoyed having you on the show.
Always a pleasure. I love hanging out with Beyond Clean.
That was Sarah B. Cruz, CSS nerd at Pre-Treat CSS, and Dave Jagrosse from David Jagrosse Consulting. And I do want to just tell everybody that if you'd like to learn more information on the One Tray's journey with the FDA, you can subscribe to www.onetray.com/subscribe. If you'd like to reach out to One Tray, you can email info@onetray.com, or you can call them at 937-619-0138. And always follow the One Tray IFU for use. That's going to do it for this vendor spotlight. But as a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or simply search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes, but you got to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. While you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or you have a recommendation for a guest on Beyond Clean, simply send an email to info@beyondclean.net. Thank you for listening to this vendor spotlight on Beyond Clean.